Waheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Waheguru Ji Ki Fateh. Thank you all for joining today's webinar hosted by the Sikh Research Institute. My name is Jasleen Kaur. Today's event will be on Sikhs, Stagecraft, and civil society, and this pertains to how Sikhs are a global community with a growing presence in the United States. The questions that will be tackled today are the following. To create influence, do we truly understand how the US foreign policy is developed and implemented? With the Biden administration's approach to its foreign policy as it may affect Sikhs. Considering that 80% of the Sikhs live in India, primarily in the state of Punjab, what are the expectations of the US-India relationship in the next few years in reference to democracy and human rights in the context of bilateral relations? This conversation will touch upon lessons and guidance to the Sikh community on how to pursue advocacy, long-term strategy, and building coalitions via both positive and not so positive case studies from the Afghan-Sikh crisis to the farmers' movement. We are very fortunate to have two thought leaders on this panel today. We have Harinder Singh, who I'm sure you all know, and we have Manpreet Singh, whose bio I'm sure you all have read, and I could go on about his long list of accomplishment for hours, but I'll pass the floor to Harinder Singh to take over the introduction.
Waheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Waheguru Ji Ki Fateh, and greetings of the day, guys, depending on where you are in the world. Before I get going on this, Manpreet Singh Anand, as his full name is, him and I were just chatting before we started, and he's like, let's be very informal. So I'm going to just call him Manpreet or Manpreet Virji. He says, can I call you Virji? I said, of course. But, you know, the issue we're going to be discussing, or a range of issues, are quite serious, and they have to do with much larger sort of a sphere, which is mentioned in the title. When we are saying Sikhs, the word Sikhs, you know, what do we really mean by this? The word statecraft is there. The word civil society is there. All these have their own political theories. They have their own criticisms. But here we will be delving into how to look at least from this lens, from a development lens of those who do want to understand where we stand in the world today. And regardless of where we are in the world as Sikhs, what can we do in order to get there? So to set this up right, look, there are 30 million Sikhs in the world currently. And the last nation state for Sikhs ended in 1849, which was the Lahore Darbar under Maharaja Ranjit Singh, which means for 172 years, we have not had state-to-state diplomacy. So let that sink in. And then if you look at another 150 years have gone by, where we tried to do it with multiple states while under British India. But since 1947, it's been 74 years that the diplomacy was done by the Sikhs within the Indian state. And it's only in the last 37 years, especially after 1984, that the diaspora Sikhs are getting involved in these things. They are getting involved because now they're politicians beyond India, in US, Canada, UK, Singapore, Malaysia, Kenya, the top 10 diasporas, and many others as well. They're diplomats, they're entrepreneurs, they're part of the military, they're part of the academia, intelligentsia. Yet, even today, in 2021, 80% of the Sikh population still lives in India. And of that, almost all of it lives in the Indian state of Punjab. So when we are discussing this issue, what we are really looking into is that there is a Pentagon in America, there is a CIA in America, there's a commerce and trade representatives in America, and there are State Department reps who have to deal with democracy and human rights and things of that nature. Even in current administration, if you have staffers who have now become part of the administration, like Sabrina Singh in the current administration, or Dalip Singh, who is part of the Treasury, or aspiring ones who are on the other side of the political parties, people like Harmeet Kaur Dhillon, you know, if there is a likely Republican administration, she might become part of that. Or even presidential candidates like Nikki Haley, aka Namrata Randhawa. So this is not really about discussing which political party to align yourself with, what should we be doing as activists, what the NGO should be doing only. This is not a discussion on that. This is the Sikh situation. In this Sikh situation, how do we make sense of what to do within America, at least, when it comes to foreign policies between India and US and how it can affect Sikhs. And I fully realize COVID is on our minds, and there's a devastation in India going on. There is no oxygen, no beds, no ventilators. And University of Washington just produced a report which is saying there are probably already 650,000 deaths in India, which is 3 times the official estimate. Which, by the way, in reference to US, they say in US reported deaths, they're about 1.5 times what they report. So every country does this for varieties of reasons. The reportings are not there, but the Indian administration is not saying much about it. People on the ground who are supporting are saying maybe it's 20x of the official number. Well, there are many charities who are supplying things to India right now. About 20 of them on my last count who are trying to do relief and aid work. But how many of them are really supplying to Punjab? Many of them are explicitly listed. They actually don't even operate in Punjab, which is where 4/5 of the Sikhs live. This is where the larger statecraft and civil society comes into play, even in this COVID-19 situation. So beyond military and diplomacy, which is the part about statecraft, and beyond government and for-profit businesses, that's the part about civil society. We want to see what can the Sikh Americans do? So in that context, I want to come to Manpreet Singh here, who has been part of the former White House administration. He's been part of the State Department, U.S. State Department. He's now part of a nonprofit sector where he is helping find solutions in the reality of things, in the absence of philosophy, and in the absence of what activists want, what governments want, still figuring out the statecraft business and civil society business for the Sikhs. So, Manpreet Singh, welcome to the forum, and thank you so much for joining us. I know we've been in conversations for a long time about doing this, and I'm so grateful that you finally agreed to do this. So thank you so much.
Well, Vaheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Vaheguru Ji Fateh. Thank you so much, Veer Ji, for that introduction and for setting the stage. And thank you for inviting me to this conversation. I think it's really great that the Sikh Research Institute is holding this webinar, that it continues to try to improve the discourse around the world on issues that matter to Sikhs around the world. And so I'm honored to be a part of this conversation as a part of that larger discussion. So thank you.
Well, let's get started. But before we get into, let's get to know you a little bit. So Manpreet, you reminded me, I had actually forgotten to let me be the first one to admit, when we re-met about 10 years ago, actually 6 years ago, you reminded me we actually first met in Texas at a Sikh camp. So first, can you share with the audience about yourself and how you got into this world of diplomacy? How, like I was a kid in Kansas, maybe 10 years senior to you, and you are a Sikh kid from Texas, whose father is an engineer and mother is a postal worker, and you end up working in senior levels of U.S. government. How does that happen?
Well, certainly it wasn't a long, made up plan for me. I think when I was a kid growing up in Texas, I was doing everything that every, American kid does growing up, enjoying time with friends and trying to do your best in school and not really thinking about the future as much. But, you mentioned the Sikh camps. Nowadays, the Sikh camps around North America are ubiquitous, and there are so many opportunities for young Sikh kids to get involved. But when I was growing up, at least where I was, it was really these summer camps that were a week or 2 weeks long, where you got to interact with other people who look like you and who were facing some of the same issues as you. In the town that I grew up, there were only 2 of us that were, Patka boys growing up in the entire town. And so, we've come a long way as a community, and I'm glad that you mentioned the power of the diaspora. Listen, my own personal story, this work, even though my mom she's now retired, but she was a U.S. Postal Service worker. She never pressured me to get into any particular career. She always encouraged me to do the best I could possibly do, no matter what I chose. But she did have a master's, or she does have a master's in political science. And I guess part of that seeped into my own psyche and thinking while growing up. And my father was an engineer. He, like so many fathers of that generation, really wanted me to be a doctor. And I was in more of a rebellious state. So I rebelled and became an engineer. And it shows you how much of a rebel I actually am, to be honest. But listen, it was, I really didn't get a sense of what my path would be and where I thought I could add value and add some contributions until gaining some life experience. And, one thing that I did take away from those Sikh camps was there were two notions that really stuck in my head from the teachings of Guru Nanak. One is the importance of seva, and the other is kirt karni. And especially on the latter, I felt like, I wanted to find a way to devote my life to be able to make other lives better, but not as something that I do on the side or on the weekends or when I have time, but rather as my own profession. And so it took me, to be honest, it took me some time to find that. But it is what led me to development work, foreign policy work, and ultimately public service. And I think there's a lesson in there for a lot of people who are interested in public service, that it is quite a noble career. There's a lot of ways in which you can help the world, and there's not just one path. There's not just one path. And I think, especially for folks of my generation, Sikh Americans, Sikh diaspora of my generation, we're standing on the shoulders of the sacrifices that our parents made to be able to give us various opportunities. And now we have the opportunity to choose a number of different paths. And public service is a great one for those who are interested. But that's a bit about how I got into this.
Yeah, I mean, I think when you were talking about being rebel, I think my rebelliousness also showed up by becoming an aerospace engineer. But I call that was my previous life. I've been born as we discover our real vocations. So eventually, the real rebel rousing, if you can call it, in some sense, is when we end up being just an immigrant's sons or daughters, right? Then we end up looking at other things. And since our conversation started with Sikhi and Sikh camp, this is where we met. Let me actually invoke that for a second in current scenario. This morning when I saw the hukum from Sri Amritsar Sahib Darbar Sahib's hukum, the Rahau line actually was saying, that without connecting with the Shabad, the classical or the literal line is Bingur Pete, that without actually offering, submitting, understanding, connecting with the wisdom, mar aaya jaiye. I mean, we're going to be dying and we're going to be coming and going. So the dying is not just physical, although that devastation in front of us globally and more so in India right now, that actually tells us that when you're standing on the pile of dead bodies, you invoke Guru Nanak Sahib. He actually said this literally, the Shabad, that I'm standing on Maspuri. That's the word he used in the Shabad, that I'm standing on the pile of dead bodies. But he says, when you are in that critical of a situation, the idea is not to respond with anger or cussing or whatever else we might be doing. There needs to be a pause. And he says, the line is, respond with gyan. Respond with what we might call deep knowledge or wisdom. And I think it's in that context I was listening to another Shabad this morning, because how do you keep sane while you're dealing with all sorts of things, including the current crisis in India? Whatever we may say about administrations, there are other crises, including of distributions and people's fears and pains and the families. And I was listening to a Shabad this morning, this being a year of anniversary of Guru Tegh Bahadur Sahib. And he very clearly says that without identification with her, which is the her literally means the one light, or in another etymological sense, it means the one who removes your fears. He says, unless you identify with the remover of the fears, there's going to be more and more pains. So, these are the paradigms of Sikhi. This is what Ekoankar or one force or oneness ideas of paradigms are. And when we are in the situation, we are asked to act with wisdom. We are asked to identify with this oneness in the world. So I'm so glad that you brought that out initially, because that's what brought us together, and we'll continue to build on it, although today's focus will shift a little bit more towards more of your field. So for the larger audience, Manpreet, you want to share anything on that regard or reflection on that before I move to?
No, I'm really glad you're connecting those dots, because I think sometimes we understand that implicitly, but we don't acknowledge it explicitly. I was just having a conversation about something similar with some colleagues from work yesterday, that we have been under so much pressure.
Manpreet,
the COVID crisis.
Can you please repeat? I think we lost you for 30 seconds or so.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
Yeah.
No, I was just saying that, I was discussing this topic recently, a strain of this topic recently with some colleagues, that so many folks have been under so much pressure in the last year. The pandemic, of course, and it produces all sorts of pressures, some apparent, some not so apparent. But then you layer on top of that what's happening in the United States, but frankly, in many parts of the world, when it comes to racist attacks and rhetoric, anti-Asian hate. Sikhs are not immune to this, as you well know. The diaspora feels this all the time. And in some cases it waxes and wanes, but really it waxes and wanes only in public attention. It doesn't necessarily wax and wane in people's lives who are living it. And now you have this crisis in India, which you've talked about, and I know we'll talk more about it in this conversation. But now this is hitting not just kind of, yes, this is a global pandemic, and how do we, work together to address it? It's hitting people's lives. I can't think of somebody in my own social circle, who have connections to people in India, who hasn't been affected in one way or another, who hasn't lost somebody that they know, or know somebody close to them that's lost somebody that they know. So there's a tremendous amount of pressure on our community at the moment, on many communities. And this is exactly the right time to get back to first principles and think about, well, what is the effect that we want to have on the world? What are the Guru's teachings? How can we live by them? So I think it's a good reminder, Virgi, and I'm glad that you brought it up.
Wonderful. It's a reminder for all of us. And I think Sikhs at large are putting their discriminations aside, and they are really, when you said public service, which is a subset of service, and the service element of Seva is coming out even within India, in diaspora and other places as well, as the new Seva is of the oxygen Seva now, the langar is of oxygen. In the macro sense, Manpreet, and I shared this with the audience earlier, that we're gonna stick to not prescriptive answers today. It's a long form sort of a discussion, because we want to really understand this. Because many of us, including me, we get very hurried sometimes as to why government is not doing enough. In this case, American government, when it comes to certain issues in India. So Manpreet, can you describe to us how the US foreign policy is actually developed? And then based on your experience in the government, how is it really implemented? And please feel free to add any, or share rather, any memorable moments or achievements from your time. And if you can also humor us with some perks of being a diplomat, is it as glamorous as it seems?
Sure. Well, I'll first start with your first question about, how is U.S. foreign policy developed? It's, I think people who don't work in this space tend to think that it's very top down. Whichever president happens to be in the Oval Office is making every decision, on every foreign policy issue, and then it just automatically gets implemented. It's a lot more complicated than that. Certainly the role of a U.S. administration under a particular president has a very, very significant and outsized impact on the foreign policy of the country. No doubt about that. The executive branch of the U.S. government is responsible for setting foreign policy objectives, for engaging with leaders around the world, for actually being in charge of implementing whatever policies are being put forward. But there are other actors that have, if not equal, certainly a very, very instrumental role in U.S. foreign policy making and implementation. I spent some time in the U.S. Congress as well as a staffer on the House Foreign Affairs Committee. And I can't understate the role that Congress has in all aspects of U.S. government, but also in foreign policy. They call it the power of the purse. Congress is responsible for providing the funding that is necessary for the U.S. government to function. And because they have their hands on those purse strings, on the funding, on the budget, there's a lot of power that Congress and members of Congress and the congressional system has on implementation. Everything from not just writing legislation, but also performing oversight. And in its truest sense, meant to reflect the will of the American people through its representatives. So Congress has a huge role as well. There's also, and I think this doesn't get stated enough, the role of private actors in foreign policy. We tend to think of government having kind of all power, but that's not true. It's not true really in any public policy issue, and certainly not true in foreign policy either. The role that the diaspora can have for various communities, including the Sikh community, the role that civil society actors can have, private companies, local communities, all of these private actors, and I use private as a very, kind of wide-ranging term, can have have a lot of influence on policy, can advocate for various reforms. Of course, have to work within the legal and regulatory framework that is out there, but there's a lot of possibility there. I'll give you one example from my time when I was with the U.S. Agency for International Development under the Obama administration. President Obama was planning a trip to India. I was, looking at a particular portion of that trip, trying to find ways in which we could get the diaspora community here in the United States more engaged in some of the development areas that would be important for India's growth and prosperity in a partnership mode. And so, this idea, which ended up becoming a viable idea where we actually helped to kind of pool resources from the diaspora community here in the United States that would go into these community investment bonds that could help to fund small and medium-sized enterprises in India focused on particular areas, water and sanitation or health or women's empowerment, lots of different areas. It took a lot of effort within the interagency of the government itself. You needed to make sure that your own agency was on board. You wanted to make sure that there was budget for this. You wanted to make sure that the State Department, the White House felt like it was in line with broader administration goals. You needed to make sure you weren't running afoul of any laws or regulations. You needed to bring Congress on board to make sure that congressional members of Congress felt like this was important and this would be reflective of kind of what our overall goals are for our relationship. So there was a lot to do to be able to build these types of policies and eventually implement them. It's not all top down. It requires a collective approach and bringing everybody on board. So I think there's, there's a lot more than meets the eye when it comes to foreign policy in these ways. I'll just give another quick example, and this is maybe more personal in a way, but might speak to your other question about kind of memorable moments for me. When I was a staffer on the Hill in Congress, I had the opportunity to travel to India as a part of a larger congressional delegation led by one of our more senior members of Congress at the time. And, I was a pretty young staffer. I was there to help support the trip, provide any information that members of Congress may need, be able to kind of, prepare them on kind of the issues, the policy issues that would be discussed, that kind of role. Important role, but by no means a senior role. At the end of the trip, we actually had an opportunity to meet the Prime Minister at the time, Prime Minister Manmohan Singh. And at first, it seemed like, with all these protocol things, only the members of Congress would be able to go and no staffers would be allowed into the room. And at the very last minute, they actually allowed, I think, 3 of us staffers to join the meeting. And in the meeting, all the talking points that I had drafted for the members of Congress who were engaging with the Prime Minister were actually being, said out loud. There was a very frank and good exchange between the Prime Minister and the head of our delegation, and in a very good meeting overall from a diplomatic sense. And then at the end, according to protocol, the Prime Minister walked all of the members out, shook everybody's hand, and then went on to shook all of us staffers' hands. And when he came to me, he put his hand on my shoulder and he gave me this look. And it really wasn't more than an instant, but it was this look of almost pride that even in our community, we could have people who looked like both of us on opposite sides of a diplomatic engagement. Not opposing sides, just opposite sides. And I think it was just a moment, but it was one of the more defining moments of my career because it helped me to recognize a couple of things. One, how privileged I was to be in that conversation, to be in that room, to be able to hear from that. And how I needed to use that privilege for good. But secondly, and perhaps more importantly, it made me realize that I had a lot more on my shoulders than just me. That I was representing my country, absolutely, the United States, but I was also representing a community, a Qom, and a very different Sikh American generation. And that has stayed with me as I've moved throughout various roles, both in and out of government. So these are the moments that I think help you recognize that, we are a community that, yes, has many challenges, but we also have many opportunities. And you want to try to take advantage of those opportunities as much as possible.
Well, thank you for sharing that. One of the things you just said, and I want to sort of comment on that before I ask you the next question, that we are on the opposite side, not necessarily opposing sides. And this is very important differentiation. Sometimes they might be opposing sides, but it is okay to be on the opposite sides within the country and outside the country, like in this case, international affairs. And I'm thinking from Guru Nanak period onwards, his travels took him from Saudi Arabia to Sri Lanka, and within the Sikh Empire, when it started from Banda Singh Bahadur period, we have had where we had to figure out how to deal with the Afghans and the Mughals and the Rajasthani kings and mediating, as Guru Tegh Bahadur did with the king which sided with the Aurangzeb and the king which did it. So we have had those relationships earlier where we have been part of opposite sides. And sometimes they were opposing sides as well, but not every time. And it's a good reminder that, look, let's not create these, because I'm seeing a rise of what I call within this caste system, which is not just Indian thing, it's very much an American thing as well. And the new Jim Crow laws, as we are seeing everywhere in America. But Sikhs are also developing this new untouchable caste, which I, talk to people within India about, and some people in the diaspora as well, that those who are trying to figure out pragmatic solutions with the opposing sides. So let's not throw them under the bus. That's the role which is needed in order to, among other roles, to figure out solutions, even if they both wear turban or don't wear turban, or even if have the Singh or Kaurs in their names. There is a role to be played. We have always had those roles, and we must continue to play those roles. So thank you for sharing those two things. Getting a little bit specific to current administration, the Biden administration, and in India, you have Modi administration. As you know, that Secretary Austin landed in India before Secretary Blinken did. So that's the reality currently. We saw the Twitter diplomacy as it is now, what the counterparts in India wrote and other parts. So given, Manpreet, how do you think the Biden administration's approach to foreign policy could affect Sikhs? And this is not specifically, I should say, the special emphasis I'm putting this right now more because for last several months, people in the diaspora, including in America, have been very concerned about this Punjabi Sikh element, not just Sikh element, which had to do with the farmers as well. So I just want to emphasize that, but it's still a broader question, but specific to two administrations. What is the Biden administration's approach to foreign policy where it will affect Sikhs and Punjabi Sikhs?
Yeah, no, thank you for that, Virjit. Let me try to address that in a couple of different ways. First, I think it's important to understand President Biden's approach to foreign policy at large. And this is one in which he has been both outspoken and steadfast in talking about an approach towards foreign policy that will be based on human rights and democracy. There are many reasons behind that. Some of it, frankly, due to domestic issues here in the United States, but much of it actually due to what we are seeing geopolitically around the world with authoritarian states and authoritarian-leaning actors in otherwise democratic states taking even more emboldened steps, which really does threaten democracy around the world. So it's important to understand that Biden's approach to foreign policy, as he stated, will be based on human rights and democracy. Now, what does that actually mean? I think it means a few different things. One, I think it means he is looking to restore American leadership for democratic values. Recognizing that we've had our own issues in this country around commitments to democracy, I think he wants to show the world that we remain committed to these values. So I think that's number one. Number two, we will see, and we've already seen, and that's partly why Secretary Austin did make that first trip to India, but we will see this administration revitalize strategic relationships. Now, strategic relationships, not just with treaty allies of the United States, but also strategic partners of the United States. And here, I think there's a recognition by this administration that the world doesn't always organize itself, right? Whether it's dealing with a global pandemic or climate change or international terrorism, that there needs to be leadership, and that the U.S. is comfortable and willing to again show leadership in these areas for the global public good. And I think also to make sure that there are not vacuums left where more maligned actors could fill those vacuums, as unfortunately we've seen in various examples. So I think that's another area. There will be a premium placed on international collaboration, international cooperation to address these more global challenges. We've already started to see that. So that's number two. Number three, I think there will be an effort to rebuild the foreign policy foundation within the United States and the diplomatic corps in particular. I can't tell you, and this is more of a kind of maybe inside the Beltway conversation, inside DC kind of conversation, but I can't tell you how much the morale at the State Department and throughout the administration, how low that morale had sunk over the previous administration. It's not meant to be a partisan discussion, so I'm not going to go there, but that is what I have heard and felt. And so I think there will be an opportunity to rebuild that foreign policy foundation. And I'll get to this later, but I think there are opportunities for Sikhs here. And then finally, I think there will be a huge focus, as we've seen actually, on recreating economic opportunities for Americans, but also for others through more inclusive and pro-poor policies. And so I think here it's not just the kind of the Build Back Better agenda that's focused on a number of different things, but there's a recognition that inequality is one of the single biggest drivers of challenges in our own society, and that this foments some of the racial divisions that we see as well, and some of the anti-Asian bias and other things that we've seen. So I think there'll be a big focus on making sure that we have a more inclusive economic growth strategy going forward. So it's important to just put that in context of kind of where I think the Biden administration is going to focus its foreign policy. Now, what does this mean for Sikhs? I think there are a couple of things. So one is, I think there are actually opportunities for Sikh Americans to actually be a part of the solution, as you mentioned, be a part of government, be a part of those organizations to actually help to influence, design, develop, and implement some of these policies. In government, we often say policy is people. And what we mean by that is that, as I mentioned before, so much policy is ground up. It's not just all coming from the Oval Office. And so you have to put the right people in the right places at the right time to be able to even produce particular policy options for leadership to decide upon. And we've actually seen this reflected in the appointments already by this administration. I think it's probably the most diverse cabinet we've seen in history. The inclusion of women is welcome, long overdue. I'm very glad to see how many women are in cabinet and other leadership positions throughout this administration. Even the National Security Advisor for President Biden has talked about broadening the definition of national security expertise so that they bring in people based on not just what their pedigree is, what schools they went to, but where they come from, what they look like, how much gender diversity is there. I think there's a recognition that by bringing people into government who come from different backgrounds, that they bring their perspectives, their experience, their historical knowledge into policymaking, which is better for the country. And this is where I think Sikhs can play more of a role. You mentioned a couple of names earlier in this webinar of Sikh Americans who are in government or those who are aspiring to be. I'm pleased to see there's another Sikh American in a role that I used to occupy at USAID in the Obama administration. I think there's a lot more that can be done there because people is policy. People is policy. And then finally, I think there is more work to do on on raising awareness of the plight of Sikhs around the world. You and I have had conversations in the past about the plight of Afghan-Sikhs, for example, which frankly, given the announcements of troop withdrawals in recent weeks, only makes that even more important. But these are the areas where I think there is more work we could be doing on raising awareness about what Sikhs around the world are facing, the circumstances they're in, and what policy options might be possible, especially from this administration, to help address some of those challenges. So those are some of the things that I think, Virji, are important to think about as we move forward with this administration.
Sure. So, I understand this people part. People make policy, and if there are more representatives of the people, in this case, Sikh representation, you will get some Sikh angles. And I see a value in it, and there are more people. In fact, you mentioned that even, I'll share the name. Dalip Singh is there. He is the deputy at NSA right now, and he comes from Federal Reserve Bank of New York. So we definitely see how even at the security world, how the economic world is playing a role, perhaps more from a geopolitical angle or even from a security angle. And he's probably the highest serving Sikh American right now in the current administration. But I want to come back a little bit to, so yes, full recognition that more second generation will be playing a role. They need to be making public service part of it, so there can be those conversations. But how to even have that conversation with those who are there, or currently, what is Biden administration's outlook towards India? Because globalization, the global Sikh issues are important, like Afghan-Sikh. But as I mentioned, 80% of the Sikhs still live in India, and 95% of them live in Panjab. And those issues, though highlighted by non-state actors, as you mentioned earlier, that a non-private business sector is equally important. So human rights organizations have done that. Some even corporate sectors have brought out certain issues. But what is Biden administration's outlook towards, or is there any, towards Sikhs?
So let me take those questions in turn. In terms of the relationship towards India, as I mentioned before, I think there is going to be a premium placed on making sure that there are strong relationships with like-minded democracies across the world, but in particular in Asia, for a number of different reasons. And in particular with India. I think that will be something that is emphasized by the Biden administration. At the same time, they've stated that human rights and democracy will be the foundation of their foreign policy. So this is a good example of where we're going to see U.S. interests and U.S. values. And do they align or do they not? And I found in my own experience that U.S. foreign policy is most sustainable when its interests and its values actually align. And my hope is that this will inform how the Biden administration approaches its bilateral relations with India as well. Listen, we're only, 3.5 months into the Biden administration, so I'm not ready to give a report card, nor is that my role. I think they're doing a lot of great things, but I think this is what's to watch out for, Virji, is how do the interests and the values align, especially with its engagement with India. And we have seen, and listen, I want to approach this from a candid perspective. Both the United States and India have experienced some backsliding when it comes to protecting and promoting those values in recent years. So there's a lot of work to do all around. And we have to approach these issues from a place of humility, at the same time as approaching it from a place of conviction. We have to be steadfast in our commitments to democracy and dignity for all. We have to recognize that not any one leader of a country, whether it's President Trump or Prime Minister Modi, that doesn't define a country. But at the same time, we can't turn a blind eye when those values are being trampled, when institutions of democracy are being gutted, or when democratic norms or rights of individuals are being trampled. So all of that is part of the conversation. One of the things that gives me a little bit of hope is that, and it doesn't get talked about enough, is that, the U.S.-India relationship is actually quite multidimensional. We talk a lot about the leaders and the chemistry of the leaders, and did so-and-so hug whom, and, that's all kind of the show, right? But in reality, we have huge and growing economic relationship between the two countries. From a kind of cultural or ethos level, both countries are multi-ethnic, multi-religious, multilingual societies. Both, have this underlying commitment to democratic values embedded in the country's constitutions, but the cultures as well. As you noted at the very outset, I mean, the U.S. has one of the largest Indian diaspora communities in the world, which in my mind actually provides perhaps the strongest ballast, for the relationship. I talked about this a lot when I was at the State Department. And just look at even the response to COVID and the latest COVID crisis in India. I think it did take a few days for the U.S. to galvanize into action in a way that was responsive to the needs in India. But since then, oh my goodness. We have seen such an outpouring of support from the diaspora, from civil society, from the business sector, and from government. And this is not happening just because there's a strategic relationship, right? Or that Secretary Austin visited India. This is because there are real life connections between Indian Americans and their family members and friends and others in India that deserves a response. And so there is more work to be done for sure, undoubtedly. But I think there is a strong foundation that we can continue to build on. And I think the Biden administration recognizes that and plans to do so.
No, I appreciate that. Just a reminder to the audience that we'll be opening up Q&A session soon. I have a couple of more questions for Manpreet, and then we'll get into your questions as well. Manpreet, building up on what you were saying currently, agree with the foundational stuff, agree with the sort of Indian and American connections through diaspora and the governments. But I still am, and I'm going to just leave this thought and we can move on, that even in all this crisis, current crisis, and even previous administrations, there hasn't been enough done to where 80% of the Sikhs live. And I keep coming back to that. We have to figure out, and maybe this is where the work is, how to make Punjab conversation more relevant. I mean, the current chief minister of Punjab, of Indian Punjab, Captain Amrinder Singh, who is, this is what we call the governor-president dynamics in America. In India, it's prime minister, chief minister dynamics. He has even said, can we get some oxygen? Because they're not getting oxygen. Why are you not letting us buy this from Pakistan? And Pakistan is offering to sell it. Diaspora is sending it, but it is not getting distributed to India because they're not landing in Amritsar, they're landing in Delhi. So there are some real life concerns here, which are well-founded as well, even if you forget the politics of it, even in humanitarian crisis. So I just wanted to mention that because this is where some of the Sikhs and some of the Punjabis, and this, by the way, is not a sentiment of diaspora. In the last week, people like Dinesh Vora, the Hindi columnist on numerologists, for example, they are saying this is really about the character of what India is going through. Sort of the conversation we were having pre-election in America. And now they're having this conversation in India. That this has nothing to do with somebody's religion. This has to do with what kind of a civil society India has become. Like, what are we really doing about these things?
Yeah.
And bringing in the Biden angle, and maybe this is a foreshadowing. I mean, we just saw something about Armenian genocide finally being recognized and acknowledged in America, and how Turkey reacted to it. And I'm sure you're aware there are enough reports where people are asking, is India going the Turkey way? You know, and if it is, maybe that's other things can happen. It sometimes take much longer for administrations to figure it out. So Manpreet, I know we can't give a report card. 130, 120 days is not, is just a foreshadowing as to what can happen. But what are your expectations with respect to US-India relations in the next few years? And let's call it next 3 years, 3.5 years. Especially, again, I'm going to dwell more on in issues which are important to Sikhs. How do the Sikh play into those relations? And we started to touch upon the COVID crisis, so I would like to make it more Sikh-centric, perhaps.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So listen, I think there are a few things to keep in mind here. One is, and I started to allude to it, but I probably didn't do a good enough job of explaining it more fully. There are going to be multiple objectives when it comes to the US relationship with India. There's going to be an objective that is strategic in nature, that recognizes India's role and power in the world, the capacity of India to be able to positively contribute to global challenges, right? Whether it's the pandemic or climate change or whatever else it might be. At the same time, because President Biden has talked about human rights and democracy being at the foundation of its foreign policy, India's own status when it comes to those issues can't be ignored. Can't be ignored. Neither can it be ignored, frankly, within ourselves, which is why I said it needs to be approached from a place of humility and conviction at the same time. Mm-hmm. So I think what that means for the US-India relationship, and specifically for Sikhs, is that there's a lot of work to be done, frankly, Virji. We're entering a new phase, right? It used to be decades ago, India's involvement with the non-aligned movement and foreign policy towards India was kind of seen as something very distant and non-prioritized, frankly, from the US perspective. Then the last couple of decades, there's a recognition that because of India's economic power, because of the diaspora, because of its opening, though not as quickly as many would like, of economic opportunities, that there needs to be a stronger relationship there. And so there was a lot of effort done by Bush administration, by Obama administration, and the counterparts, okay, on both sides, to be able to strengthen those relationships. Now we're hitting a point where nobody is saying that we should not have a strong or close relationship with India, at least within the kind of foreign policy community. And so the question is, well, what does that relationship look like? And how does that affect those communities, like the Sikh community, who do have major issues, right? And that's all work to be done. That has not been done. But there are areas where I think there's a role that various communities can play in helping to shape those conversations. And we can talk about that, and I'm happy to talk about that. One last thing I'd just say is, you've mentioned the farmers' protest a couple of times. This is an issue that that perhaps has not gotten the attention that it deserves here in the United States. But in a way, and I may get some angry tweets because of this, but in a way, I think it's not surprising. And part of it is because I don't think as a community here in the United States, we've done the work to be able to build a level of awareness, let alone influence, to be able to inform the foreign policy community here about what this means, why it's important to look at, and how this plays into the larger relationship. So there's more work to be done there, Virji. And one last thing on the farmers' protest. I think no matter what you think about the policies being debated, and I won't get into that, no matter what you think about the policy and whether it makes sense or it doesn't make sense for India or for the people or for the farmers, what it shows is that there's been a breakdown in trust between policymakers and a large community. And so when civil society does not trust the government to pursue goals in its best interest, that's when you have these breakdowns. That's when you have these cleavages. And so this is the opportunity to try to find ways to try to rebuild trust. It's easy to say, very hard to do. But in order for there to be any progress, that's what you have to look at.
Jasleen Kaur is here, which means we need to start taking audience questions. So I'll wrap up with the last questions with you. So Manpreet, what you just mentioned is basically an acknowledgement for Sikh Americans that we have not really worked on the level of awareness to create that influence. So perhaps the level of awareness we have done is more about who Sikhs are versus what Sikh values are and how they need to be distributed, not just in America, but reconnect with the people in the homeland or in South Asia through India and somewhat through Pakistan. On that point, a little bit more, and that's my last question. This is the only how question then. You opened yourself to it, so I'm going to ask that one now. What really is the work for Sikh Americans here to pursue these kind of advocacy goals? What guidance will you provide them? Maybe a more to create that influence. Because we have that aspiration, right? Afghan-Sikh crisis happened. We think they should do what Canada does, but although Canada was also struggling to do it and they haven't done it yet, or they finally did a little bit of it. So all of a sudden, we are asking the Biden administration, some are asking congressmen, congresswomen, their representatives. And then there is a farmers' protest situation. We are expecting statements from the administration and again from Congress. But really, maybe those are what you are calling earlier in a different context. You said there is a show of things and there's the influence of things. So the only place where we can come up with influence currently is through what some of us are calling soft power, which means that we don't have any state power anywhere in the world, but we do have these soft powers, which means that's the influence of business, the influence of being part of the representation team or part of the lobbying efforts or part of the strategic missions, those kinds of soft influences. What explicit guidance you have for Sikh Americans to actually start venturing into creating influence?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And listen, I want to be clear, I'm not making any normative judgments about the Sikh American community and its ability to influence. This is just an attempt to try to be helpful and based on my own experience and what's been effective and some areas that the community could look into. So I think your question is a really important one, Virji, and I would and I know we want to get to audience questions, so I'll quickly outline a few key elements from my perspective. So, first is we have a very strong, robust and active community at a local level, very active. Every community that I've been a part, every Sikh community I've been a part of in the United States, the local gurdwaras are doing so much outreach, so much seva for the local community. It's time to leverage those relationships into being able to raise issues and advocate for various policy outcomes with your local representatives, with your state representatives, with your national representatives. And this is not partisan. I'm not talking about any type of partisan. I'm just talking about use the systems of governance, right? You have representatives who are meant to represent your communities. We have active communities who do a lot for the places that they live in. leverage that work. Secondly, I'd say invest in long-term relationships with key stakeholders. And that's not just when you need something, right? This takes dogged work over years. It requires making sure you have an understanding of the network out there that are dealing with these kinds of policy issues and what they care about and why. Embed yourselves in those conversations. I think this is something that could be hugely impactful. Third, I'd say, when it comes to the larger issues, we were talking about U.S.-India relations, find ways to link your objectives to broader U.S. foreign policy objectives or domestic priorities. What are we trying to achieve as a community? How does that relate to what the United States is trying to do? How can this be in support of that? Make those connections explicit. I think that's really important to make sure we create kind of an aligned approach. You have to find, in this way, advocates and champions to be able to speak on your behalf as well. It can't only come from our community. And then that leads into my last suggestion, which is really around allyship. How do you form coalitions with other organizations, whether they're civil society organizations or human rights groups, and importantly, especially for our community, amongst different Sikh-oriented groups, to be able to present a united front. I think that is also really important. There are examples, and we can talk about this further if you'd like. There are examples how other diaspora communities have done this and have done it successfully or with mixed success. I'm speaking in my personal capacity here, but I work with an organization that works with various diaspora communities around the world when it comes to democracy issues. We've done a lot with the Hong Kong diaspora, for example, and what they have had to face in recent months, and how they've engaged on some of these similar tactics. So there are lessons to learn here from other communities. It's just about getting started and doing the work. And there are, and again, there's not a normative judgment. There are really great organizations out there, Sikh organizations that are already doing some of this work. It's just about becoming active.
Great. Thank you, Manpreet. I think I like the way you put it, and it makes sense to me, where we have done a lot at the local Gurdwara levels and local organizational levels. And in the post 9/11 world, we did go after national level organizations who try to do multiple things. And perhaps we need to now start thinking strategically about organization whose job is to do just this, whether it is through lobbying or through those long-term relationships, where the work is, we need at least one and eventually 2, 3 who are constantly working on creating those relationships and influences. Perhaps some of the listeners and some funders can think about, when they think about creating long-term institutions, if you want influence, this is the one which we don't have, which is solely focused on that. Thank you, Manpreet. Jasleen, let's have some questions from Manpreet from the audience.
Yes, so we have a question from Amandeep, and I'm going to direct the question at both of you. So what are the issues dear to Sikhs which we can get behind?
Well, you're not going to like my answer, because I'm going to push it back to all of you. I think one of the issues, and it actually maybe builds off what Virji just said. We have a very vibrant diaspora across the world, but from a governance standpoint, we don't necessarily have any structures in place outside of Punjab that offers opportunities, channels for people to be able to raise issues that they think are important for the Sikh community. And so this isn't a question, I could give you my opinion, but it's just one person's opinion. That's not really how it should be done. We should be able to have structures in place where these issues come up. I'm in the space of promoting democracy. So this is inherent to my way of thinking, that there needs to be more small d democratic ways in which issues can be surfaced, debated, and then acted upon. And I think that requires different governance structures than what we have in place at the moment. Virji may have very different ideas of this.
Well, I'm on the other side of that, where you're trying to convince people on the ground, those who are either because of the absence of the leadership or governance trying to do that, or are getting appointed or self-appointed to do that. And it's very hard. There is no governance. I'll fully agree with you. And we struggle with governance even in our local organizations. And then to talk about at a national level of governance structure, our work is definitely cut out globally on that, including in Punjab. There is no governance structure for us. And if we want to be serious about it, we can at least start with Missile America and try to do that. You're going to need 3 to 5 full-time people working on that for a few years to actually bring that together. But we know what's on people's minds. So Amandeep's question, we know what's on our minds. I mean, right now, in last 1 year, the farmers' movement has been on everyone's mind, whether you are Sikh or not. If you are from Punjab, from India, from Sikh background, yes, that's very much on mind. Now, COVID situation is mine. Ideas of human right abuses in India have been on Sikhs' mind and things of that nature. But what's in mind is what we're learning today is if you want to go beyond a personal effort, if you want a collective effort which makes sense and which the governments at some point can become partners because they understand what you have done is not a PR campaign for an individual organization, but something it is on behalf of the community, then there can be some structuring there, and we need to align that with the values of the countries where we are creating those asks.
I think that's very beautifully answered. Yeah. I think even following the train of thought of the farmers' protests and human rights violations, Talvinder has a question. How can we lobby world governments for our homeland? And I will direct the question towards Manpreet Singh.
Well, there's a lot packed into that very short question. Some assumptions and some pronouns which I don't know who are we describing as we in that question. Listen, I think there is I'm going to give an answer which will sound like a non-answer, so I'll apologize for that up front. But I think there is, especially from the diaspora community, I think there's a lot of interest in fighting for Sikh rights, for the protection of Sikhs who have been persecuted in various parts of the world. And all too often, the solution that seems to be the simplest, but certainly is anything but, is for a homeland of some kind. I mean, we're not the only community that has voices along those lines that talks about that. And so, this is not something that I think is an assumption that people can make that is unified across the entire Sikh community. I know that there are those who feel strongly about that, but there are also many who feel strongly against. So this is why it's a non-answer to your question, but I think the question itself assumes a certain solidarity in that position that I actually don't think exists.
Fair enough. All right. We have another question from Inderbal. So how do the lessons of US Sikhs translate to other Sikh diaspora, say in the UK, where our advocacy is short-termist, fragmented, and partisan? Any shortcuts? I'll begin by directing this question towards you, Manpreet Singh, and then we'll hear what Harinder Singh has to say.
Yeah, listen, I think there are lessons to go all around. I don't necessarily think it's one way. Actually, I think there's a lot that we can learn from the Sikh communities in the UK and Canada that have been around, if not longer, have been a larger proportion of the population. Listen, our community is also diverse, right? Yes, I would imagine, though I haven't seen data on this, I would imagine that in the United States, most Sikh Americans lean in a particular partisan direction, just because I would imagine it follows closely some other similar minority groups, but I don't have data to support that. And really, that's not necessarily the most important. As again, a small D Democrat, I'm also a big D Democrat, but as a small D Democrat, I think it's important for our community to have a diversity of views, to be able to advocate for issues that individuals feel is important to them. I don't necessarily see that as a drawback. Now, whether it's short-termist or fragmented, I'm not sure what's being referred to there. But I do think that it's important that we distinguish between issues that are political issues that Sikhs, frankly, any other community ought to have a voice on how they feel like they should be governed, versus those that are inherent to us as Sikhs because of our identity. And I think it is important to distinguish between those and not feel like we have to create a monolith, if you will, on every policy issue. I don't know if that's what's being implied by that question, and if it's not, I apologize. But I do think it's important to understand we're a diverse community as well.
That's very beautifully answered. What are your thoughts, Harinder Singh?
Look, I agree with Manpreet, and let me put it in a different perspective, though. We have always been a diverse community. 100 years ago, when I put in perspective, when we became a non-nation state, and under the British, there were, if I may even break it down, among the active Sikhs who were pursuing their goals. This is really about pursuing which goal you are identifying with. When they were pursuing it, some were pursuing freedom for, literally political freedom through access, and some through allies. So, there were people who worked with Japanese and the Germans, including from Indian National Army, founded by General Mohan Singh, eventually headed by Subhash Chandra Bose. Then there were people who joined the British. They served under the British troops all over the globe, when we talk about World War I and World War II, Sikh sacrifices. So that's the not just opposite side, but also opposing camps in this case, based on today's discussion earlier. And there was a third group which said, we don't want to work with either one of them because we don't think we can achieve our articulated goal. So they fought independently, and that included the Babbar Akalis, the Bhagat Singhs, and Kartar Singh Sarabbas. So I think that's the point to be understood from, if I understood the Inderpal's and even earlier, I'm trying to remember the name, Talwinder's question. I think the articulation of the goal, the consolidation of the goal, and showing that it is a goal of a percentage of the community, and then working diligently on that goal is important, instead of saying all Sikhs believe this, all Sikh Americans believe this. That's where we get in trouble. We are very diverse politically, practice-wise, religiously, culturally. Economic disparity is very much in the Sikh world as well. We have our own share of racist, casteist, and sexist people. So when we have political ideologies which are sometimes not just Democrat or Republican, or in case of Canada, NDP or conservatives or liberals, or in case of UK, the Tories versus the Labour, and etc. And just like in India, you're seeing this in India. There are people who are in Congress, there are people who are Akalis, and there are people who are in BJP, and they've served in all administrations that they continue to. I think the point here is we all do recognize that we are a diverse group and not a monolith. I think we very well recognize that. What I want to go back to Manpreet's point earlier, but those who want to fight for a particular goal, do we know how to address this? Do we have a way of data providing some insights to pursue that goal with the actors you want to work with, including non-state and state actors? But a caution on the data part in American context. Pew Research Center, I think it was a 2012 poll. They put out the numbers were 280,000 Sikhs. Our estimate at the time, including with Sikh Coalition and my sort of understanding of visiting pretty much all major diaspora cities, I just looked at number of gurdwaras, number of people who attended. My number was somewhere between 500,000 and 700,000. So be careful with the data as well. But data provides one basis to look at things. It is an essential basis, and also know that the data is not able to cover all elements. As we talk about in COVID era, it equally applies to Sikh numbers as well.
You make some very valid points. Thank you for that answer. We're going to take one last question, and this is from Kirpal. Is there an effective advocacy and lobbying model for a non-state dispersed global community like the Sikhs? And I will direct this question towards Manpreet Singh.
No, it's a great question. And yes, there are some good models out there. I mean, you can look at the Tibetan community, right? The Tibetan community has not had their state in Tibet. There's a whole community in exile that lives out of Dharamsala, where they have a central Tibetan administration and all of that. And what they've done in terms of advocacy for the issues that they care about is a worthwhile model to look at. None of these are exact parallels, so I want to just give that caveat at the outset. And I mentioned actually even the Hong Kongers before, which is again a different situation. Obviously, Hong Kongers were operating under this framework of one country, two systems, which has been completely violated by China in the last 18 months, and has rendered Hong Kongers in a way in a very different idea of statehood than they had before. So there are different models out there that are worth looking at. There are some common elements to what makes them effective, at least in terms of advocacy here in the United States. Getting bipartisan support is I think a really important element of it. It's really hard to find anything that is bipartisan in the United States at this moment in time, but there is uniform recognition and support for Hong Kongers and Tibetans. Some of that might be geopolitical with respect to China, but a lot of it is based on human rights, fundamental human rights. So there's that, there's that kind of element. There's some of the things that I talked about before, investing in long-term relationships. The Tibetan community has invested in long-term relationships with various folks here in the United States, and that's paid dividends. I mentioned before, linking kind of your issues to broader U.S. foreign policy objectives. I mean, listen, one of the reasons that there's so much support for Hong Kongers is because China's actions in the last 18 months have directly violated international treaty obligations. And the United States stands for upholding the rule of law and an international order that is based on that. So there are ways to find common cause with policymakers. It takes some work, it takes some thoughtfulness, but it can be done. And there are some good models out there to look at.
Thank you. Thank you for that answer. And I guess this will conclude the Q&A portion of the webinar. I would first like to thank both Harinder Singh and Manpreet Singh for leading this session. Your insight on the topic has given all of those watching so much to think about and has answered so many of our hard-pressing questions. So big thank you. Next, I would like to introduce the this year's Siddiq program. So Sikhi will be hosting Siddiq 2021, a virtual leadership and development program for young adults seeking to increase their commitment towards the Sikh faith. It will be held over 2 weeks, starting Sunday, July 22nd, and going all the way till August 7th. Please note that Civic is available for adults aged 18 to 40 years old, but 17-year-olds will be considered as long as they've completed high school. Registration is available on our website at www.sikhri.com. And lastly, I hope you all tune into our Sikhcast. This will conclude today's webinar. Thank you all for attending, and I hope you have a wonderful day. Waheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Waheguru Ji Ki Fateh.
Waheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Waheguru Ji Ki Fateh.